Welcome to the latest ECIST podcast. I'm joined today by Jyothi Nippani. Can I hand over to you, Jyothi?
Hi, everybody, and hi, Andrew. So, good day. I'm Jyothi Nippani, and I'm the National Clinical Lead for Reducing in Hospital Length of Stay.
And I think we're here today really to ask you to talk a little bit about criteria to reside. So can you start off by telling me what are criteria to reside?
Um, for me, criteria to reside is essentially a tool to identify those patients whose care can be delivered without needing to be an inpatient in an acute bed facility. So, preferably the care if it's delivered at home or as a same day emergency care. And it's really important from the patient's perspective. Criteria to reside is really important from the patient's perspective. Um, the reasons are patients don't really want to spend any amount of time than necessary away from home in a hospital bed, especially. There's a real risk of nosocomial infection, and recently it's COVID-19, but before that there were other infections as well. There is a real risk of deconditioning with older patients. We know that very well, and we know that with patients with dementia, strange places and hospitals are strange places for them, and it's really not the best place for them to be treated. And most importantly, when the same patients or their family, when they are acutely unwell and when their care can only be delivered from an acute hospital bed, we need to maximize that resource of an acute hospital bed. And this was really the big thinking when it was introduced. So we thought that most patients who need an acute hospital bed and whose care can only be delivered from an acute hospital bed, we wanted to maximize that resource, and that was why we introduced criteria to reside. So if I go on a little bit more about criteria to reside, it's actually, it was put together as a checklist. It's a very basic checklist, and it was put together by the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. And it's got a list of four reasons. Either it's physiology, therapy, recovery, or function. And within those, there are some sub-criteria. And if at the board round, if the answer to any of these questions in the criteria is no, or if the answer to all of these questions in this criteria is no, then we must think of a way of managing these patients in an alternative setting or an alternative pathway. Shall I go on a little bit more, Andrew, in a bit more detail, or?
Yeah. So I think criteria to reside came out as part of the government's response to COVID-19, and clearly we're hopefully past that peak now. Can you just describe to me how you see them being relevant and being used in the kind of post-COVID world that we're entering to now?
Okay, so I absolutely think that they will be very much relevant and continue to be relevant after the pandemic. And the reasons are all the reasons I just mentioned as to why they were introduced from the patient perspective still exist even after the pandemic. And if you think carefully, this is what we always wanted to do anyway. This is what we were aiming for, but things got accelerated because of COVID. So this is something that was always, in our improvers' minds to do this. And this is the second wave. We don't know how many more waves will be coming going forward. And rather than firefighting each time, why don't we create sustainable solutions? So these are all the reasons I think it's going to be relevant well after well into the future.
When criteria to reside did come out, there was, if we're being honest, quite a lot of bad press from a number of clinicians and quite a lot in medical literature and on Twitter and things about that was a bit negative about them. How do you think we can start to change clinicians' minds about an understanding criteria to reside and change how they feel about them?
A very good point, Andrew. So if you really think about why did it get that bad press, yes, it was introduced in a hurry at the beginning of the pandemic without clinical engagement or wide consultation. And no apologies for that, because it needed to be done, because it was a pandemic and things needed to be done at speed. It was perceived as a top-down performance management tool for assurance. It was also seen as a data burden. Yes, and the way the data was collected, it was a data burden. But if it is done differently, it doesn't need to be a data burden. It was also viewed as an operational exercise rather than a frontline clinician's tool for improvement. And that's why we ended up having lots of data quality issues. Either the data was not collected because there was confusion as to why they were doing it, the people didn't know why they were collecting it or how to collect it, or when they did collect it, the information was not accurate, because the best accurate information you get only from the clinical team who's looking after the patients, but the data was collected by different people who really didn't know the patients very well. So if you want to go about and change the thinking around criteria to reside, we probably need to address those issues which I've just talked about. So we work on all those reasons. We take time to engage the clinical teams, explain why. If you explain why, they may come up with better, innovative, alternate pathways, and that's what people do. The frontline teams know best how to innovate. We need to assure them that it is not for performance management, but it can address unwarranted variation. We can show them how you can use this for improvement and the value of accurate data. So that's another teaching and training exercise. And we need to flip the question so that it resonates well with the clinical teams, and not ask them to justify why a patient needs to be in a hospital, but come up with as I said, flip the question and ask them, what services, if it was available or if it was developed, would you feel it's safe to discharge the patient? And once you actually have some data, you get a report and feed it back to the team so that they can see the effect of their improvement. So if they made a change, they can see what is the effect of that change they made on their patient care. That really inspires them to do more innovation and work better. So these are the reasons how you can actually engage our clinical teams.
That sounds great, and I know you've got some real practical examples from your own trust. So do you want to just talk us through and explain what you've been on as a journey in your own organisation and how you've changed people's thinking about criteria to reside, improved the data quality, and then used it as a tool for good? Could you talk us through what you have done?
So I almost used most of the things I've just said. So we worked with the clinical team to start with. We used our existing dashboard, which was already there, which we used to do red to green in our hospital. So we changed that dashboard, working with the team, and changed them to the criteria to reside drop-down menu. So there was already engagement and consultation with the clinical teams on why they're doing that, so they could see why we were designing this tool in the first place. We absolutely assured them that it was not going to be for performance management. It was just going to be for engagement, for improvement. And then we sort of didn't use it as a data collection exercise. We got the data collected by the right time at the board round daily. It was the role of one member of the clinical team every day to update the data at the board round where the discussions were taking place, so that the data that was being collected was accurate. Once this was done, the assurance given to the team was that nobody else would come around with a clipboard and ask them the same questions again. So that was the assurance they got. So there was no more site visits to the team by the site managers as long as the information was accurate and updated. And the reports, once we did some improvement, the reports were actually fed back to the team so that they could see the effect of their work. So all the sort of things which I just said, we put them. And once we got some data and we knew that it was accurate, it was really up to us, up to the team to work on those changes which needed to be done. So we worked on the feedback that was coming up with in these reports, and it almost led to a perfect week. So we made lots of changes, like the community teams stopped waiting for confirmation of the start date for packages of care before agreeing to bridge the gap. That changed the rate of discharge dramatically. We improved the communication between the teams. So the dashboard that was being updated was actually visible to all the entire organization and also to the system partners. So everyone could see what the patients were waiting for. The communication was real time, and actions were updated real time. So there was no need for multiple phone calls and waiting for confirmation from other teams. One of the other things which came up was, there's a need for phlebotomy. So we started phlebotomy very earlier on in the day, so that we could get on, patients waiting for blood tests, we could get them done early. We made changes to pharmacy. We improved the internal referral processes. We restored some of the SDEC principles. So lots of changes were made based on what the information that we were getting, which led to almost doing a perfect week. And this is how, once they saw all the changes and how the flow improved based on all the changes, that based on the responsiveness of the organization, people had faith in this data collection, and we could show that the data accuracy had improved.
And did that result in any changes in length of stay or bed occupancy?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So in the length of stay, we dramatically improved the 7-day length of stay, 14-day length of stay, the 21-day length of stay, and the number of beds used in the organization fell by almost 40 in a span of about a couple of weeks. So the whole system could appreciate the effect of these small improvements on the flow in the organization. Not a lot of this was very high tech or didn't need too much of investment. It just needed tweaking of small services, at the right times, really.
That's amazing. That's really inspirational. So thank you very much for that. Is there anything more you want to say? Or...
So, Andrew, I know you've worked a lot with Criteria to Reside in improving engagement regionally in your own region. So could you speak a little bit about your experience and what you thought were the barriers to Criteria to Reside in the area where you work?
So I think, as you said, when it came out as part of the first wave of COVID, it very much came out down an operational route as a data collection exercise and a must do, and the messaging to clinicians wasn't really didn't explain the why behind it, and so I think it just was perceived as a data burden, another example of more data collection to give back centrally without there being any real clarity as to what that meant for the organisation and what purpose it served. And I think, as you said in what you said earlier, trying to explain that as that question about what would there need to be in place to feel confident to discharge your patient that doesn't meet the criteria to reside, and how can we turn that as a tool for quality improvement in describing new services or what we need to do differently, seems to be the key in getting good clinician engagement. And as you said earlier, the data quality is only as good as the clinicians inputting it at the beginning. So making it a very clinician-led exercise is really important. Sending around a clerical person later in the day to collect it is a way, I think, of almost guaranteeing poor data quality. So it's that, can you explain the purpose of it to the clinicians and get those clinicians engaged, and then you get a really different quality of data.
And in your experience, has technology helped in this data collection? Did most hospitals have the technology to collect the data and automate it, or were they struggling with that as well?
So I think when Criteria to Reside first came out, a few trusts that in the region I work in had electronic patient record systems that allowed it to be done quite quickly. Others it took a little while, and certainly to begin with, it did feel that it was a kind of, as you described, a clipboard-led data collection exercise. But I think most organisations have now caught up and are recording it on their electronic patient record. That makes it part of business as usual rather than another data collection. I think that's its key to its success. Is they're normal questions you would ask on your board round, and that data is collected automatically.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for your time, Jyothi and Nippani, and talking to us today about Criteria to Reside.